other people do it. So I just wanted to give a little bit of an overview, maybe a context of this. I wrote a bit of a blog about informal and formal volunteering that I'm happy to share after this. And we have a community action response partnership, and I'm going to be leading a working group looking at informal and formal volunteering. Lucy, if I go like a Dalek, can you just flag your hand, because I can still see you, and then I'll know to stop talking and know where I've got up to. And it's really interesting, this formal and informal space, because some people may not even identify that as ourselves. So we might think of what we do as just acts of kindness, enabling us, connectedness. They all have subtle nuances and feel very different for us personally, and we all interpret them in different ways. And I think for me, informal volunteering is this very delicate web that already exists within a place that you're trying, or I'm constantly trying to rebuild and sort of firm up. And it's often unseen, and I think it's easily broken. So with some big club boots of somebody coming in. And I think it's those informal relationships and connections that I've always been fearful for. But now I'm equally fearful for the formal volunteering sector as well. So a lot of us during the COVID crisis have seen a resurgence of connection with our neighbours. We've seen many people reaching out to others in an informal way, you know, but we've also seen a lot of people offering their time to formal volunteering services, some getting despondent because they've not been called upon. So we've said a lot of it, that we can, even though we don't do something formally, a lot of us have supported other people informally, but don't often see that. Don't see checking in on a neighbour or going to do a bit of shopping as informal volunteering. And should we? So this is one of the questions I keep playing and toying with myself. But we've also witnessed many, many desperate people who have no support, who may have no food, especially if we start thinking of holiday hunger. So many people who have lost people they love and have lost jobs and skills and confidence and contact with friends and family, and they have no support, or they may live in places where people don't have the capacity to support them themselves. And this is where informal volunteering is really key. Our charity sector, our formal groups and organisations are quite key for going to places where there's not the capacity or the agency of neighbours and people to support. And I think it's really interesting about that informal support, individual action, sense of community, call it what you will, it doesn't appear out of nowhere. It needs support, or it needs a reason. So often people will respond in a crisis, but before and after a crisis, we endeavour to help people to build that resilience, to build that network, so they're better resilient to face a crisis. You keep freezing a bit. Does that mean I keep freezing a bit?
No, you've been clear, Tracy.
Okay. And I think volunteering, be it formal or informal, needs encouragement. It also needs the right environment to become established and to flourish. People need nurturing, and mainly by other people, you know, so people need people. And as well as the right resources, we also need to find the time in order to be able to give that to other people. So I think time is a huge factor. I also think people are looking at both the formal and the informal world with envious eyes. I hear that, you know, the War of the Worlds. Who's old enough to remember the War of the Worlds? Hands up, please. Thank you, or I'm showing my age. But there's a whole line And then I found it today because I wanted to quote it. This is the random part of the talk, where it says, no one would have believed in the middle of the 20th century that human affairs were being watched keenly and closely by intelligence greater than ours. Yet across the gulf of space, intellects vast and cool with unsympathetic regard of our earth look on us with envious eyes, slowly and surely drawing their plans. And I feel that just keeps coming to fore when I think of formal volunteering projects and groups, looking at all this informal work, going, how can we get them to become part of us? You know, how can we move them on to formal volunteering? And I also see statutory agencies and public bodies looking at the formal volunteering, going, how can we get them to fill our gaps in? So all the time, there's bigger entities looking at that individual action, that collective action, going, how can we use this? How can we make the most of this? How can we keep it going? And that is, I suppose, and I think with people looking on it and wanting parts of it, there's now becoming a hierarchy of what's better than others. And we often see formal volunteering as better than informal volunteering. Yet both are key, both are absolutely key, and none should be positioned other than the other. The only reason formal volunteering has a higher status is because it can be controlled, it can be funded, and it can be directed. Whereas informal volunteering can't. You know, it's nebulous. But then people go, well, where's the safeguarding? Where's the controls? We shouldn't allow this to happen. Yet we need this to happen as a human race. So these are the things my poor head has in it constantly. So I thought I'd share some of them with you. But so for me, it's really important that we as individuals, as human beings, whatever we do, make sure that we can support those fragile, informal volunteering actions, that person to person, call it what you will, neighbouriness, communityness, human kindness. We need to keep that flourishing and growing, because this will not be the first time we have had a crisis, and it will not be the last. But as soon as people try to formalise those groups of people, it'll change. Who remembers Big Society? I was here for that one. I used to prefer to recall it BS. So I had my own initials for that one. And that's where people very, very quickly said, actually, you can do this. And there was a huge backlash out of there because the choice had gone, and people's agency and people's autonomy to be involved. They were suddenly being told, well, it's your job to do this. And like, I don't think it is. And where's my time, resources and support to do this? And yet for formal volunteering, there's not the support, there's not the structure. People still look at volunteering as a free resource or a cheap resource, but actually we are investing in human beings. And if we do not have that safety net of formal volunteering, a lot of people will not just be isolated and lonely and go without, but if we've got a recession coming and maybe even a depression coming, we will need our charity sector and our groups more than ever, and they will be at the bottom of the queue, or they will be forced to jump through hoops and try get these informal volunteers on board. So how do we support them and support the informal stuff and make sure it doesn't all get wrapped up into one homogenous group? How do we make sure that we can articulate and advocate the needs of the different levels and people's different reactions? So that is just a little bit of my mind's wandering in an overview. I'm really mindful of the time. I don't know whether I've gone over. I usually does. But I think for me, whether it's informal or formal, what we have to do is get people to validate and value both. And what we have to do is support both. And when people are trying to get us to pick and choose or to put a hierarchy in place, I think we have to push back and say, actually, we need both because they're very different. And there's lots of different layers in that. So I've simplified it to informal and formal. But I think we as human beings need other people. And some of that might just be a formal support network, and some of it might be an informal support network. But moreover, we need people. And I think that's where I'm going to leave it there. You can ask me questions either in the chat, or we'll come back for a bigger discussion. You'll get your chance to agree or disagree with me. But I wanted to sort of look at, so that's me just pontificating about what I think. But I thought it'd be really nice to hear from Sally about what it's like in Suffolk, and then Anne, that's very much on that front end project delivery. So I'm going to hand over to Sally now to just talk about the experience or the work that she has seen come up in the area. Thank you.
Lovely, thank you, Tracy. So yeah, as she says, I want to sort of talk about the Suffolk experience and sort of what the team and I have sort of witnessed at Community Action Suffolk and what we've seen happening in communities. And sort of from the start, middle of March, it was just incredible how the Suffolk community came together. People were activated. I think they were stimulated by a common cause. Everyone was in this together. COVID affected all of us, and it really just, yeah, absolutely activated people into action. We did some mapping of the activity that was happening across the county, which included sort of businesses and charities and individual groups. And there was over 1,000 different responses that we saw of how people were responding to COVID and helping out. And I'd say about 600 were community groups, with probably about 400 of them being informal, more sort of mutual aid groups. And they were based around sort of faith groups, maybe a parish council, voluntary groups, businesses, and then a lot of them were sort of just purely resident led. So a resident or two within a community saying, we're going to do something. So they varied from being purely online. So there was some like WhatsApp groups that might have been just for a street, maybe a Facebook page, a community group. Nextdoor, I think we saw a sort of higher profile of the Nextdoor app, and that had a place. So these groups were purely online, connecting neighbours together. And then we had the more sort of self-organised mutual aid groups, which were probably online as well, but also went offline. So they made sure that people in their community that weren't online could access their groups. So quite often they had a phone, a central number, they leafleted their community, and they made sure that people could contact each other to get help. We saw groups that were organised around local businesses, and also existing community groups sort of diversified what they were doing. And then, as I mentioned before, we have our established network of good neighbour schemes. So they were very quick to be able to sort of react and respond to COVID. And then, as Tracy was mentioning earlier, importantly, we had the neighbour to neighbour response, people just helping out the neighbours that they already knew, checking in on family, checking in on neighbours. You know, can we even call it volunteering? You know, it's being kind, it's just using those connections that you've already got. And that's really important, because there was already some trust there. So you weren't having to build that up. You were just kind of checking in on those people that you already know already. It's a familiar face. And I think without that, we wouldn't have had, you know, the sort of positive response that we've had to COVID. It was so important. So, you know, as I said before, these groups set up at incredible speed, leaving, I think, some of the more structured organisations in their dust. I mean, it was just incredible how within 24, 48 hours, a group had formed. So, you know, as a team at CAS, you know, we've talked about, well, what did make these groups so successful? How could they do this so quickly? And the sort of things that we've come up with is around that they were so very much grassroots. It was people being able to share their time, their skills, their experience and their gifts. We weren't expecting people to be square pegs in round holes. People were coming forward with what they could offer, what their experience was. They had their common purpose. People wanted to volunteer because they believed in the cause. They wanted to make a difference. It maybe felt more like a reciprocal relationship between helper and recipient. And in fact, when we think about the term mutual aid, mutualism breaks down that divide between helper and helped. community groups such as Good Neighbour schemes moved from being a nice to have in a community to essential, that the community really did need this. And in fact, we saw villages and communities that had contacted us before wanting to set up a Good Neighbour scheme and just hadn't been able to sort of get enough support locally. Then within days, weeks of COVID, were contacting us saying, right, we want to do it, we want to set up the Good Neighbour scheme. And they set up very quickly because all of a sudden they could see the need, see the purpose for making a difference. There was little or no red tape or bureaucracy to setting up a mutual aid group. And I think a big difference was that people were released from work. They were either working from home, they were furloughed, they had time to spend in their community. This is where we saw younger people getting involved with volunteering locally. And then we also saw partnerships and collaborations. The shared aim was so urgent and important that competitiveness, past conflict was forgotten. People just had to get on with it and make a difference. And we saw local businesses getting involved with their community where they might have been sort of selling their wares before. They were in this together, and those kind of sort of purposes left a bit. So what other sort of informal volunteering did we see in Suffolk? Well, we saw, of course, the thousands of PPE equipment being made by volunteers at home, masks, scrubs, shields, the acts of kindness that we've already talked about, the flowers, the pots of jam, the cooked meals, the fun and fitness in the street, people walking each other's dogs. And we're now seeing, I think, as we're moving through this sort of litter picking, more people are getting out and litter picking because I don't know why, but we seem to be seeing a rise in rubbish. So people are now being sort of more activated to do something around that. So I just want to quickly go through a few examples of mutual aid and informal volunteering that we saw in Suffolk. So a lovely example in Haverhill, a town, was a nail bar called Matilda Rose, and it was managed by a young man called Jamie. He popped on Facebook a post, a call to action, saying, you know, can people, you know, sort of put their hands up to help out the community? There's older people, I want to help, can anyone help? So they set up the Matilda Rose squad, and within days they had volunteers working over a sort of 4-week cycle, offering sort of prescriptions and food shopping to their local community. Jamie said the squad was set up in response to coronavirus. However, we will definitely be carrying it on once life reverts back. This is an unexpected situation that's really highlighted the needs for services like this for vulnerable and isolated people. Younger generations have social media and the internet as their ways of connecting communicating. And although these can be great, many are now understanding their limitations. So that was just a really lovely example of how a business could get involved with the community and bring people together. There was a Facebook group, Ipswich Makerspace, which is where like-minded people get together and share their interest in all things creative or technological. They used their equipment and their knowledge to create thousands of shields, face shields. They lacked the volunteer resource to assemble these shields together and get them out across the county of Suffolk. So they were connected, we helped connect them to other volunteer groups, and they were sent boxes of the parts of these shields. They assembled them locally and then distributed. So there was a really great, and that took an Ipswich group to distributing what they were making across the county. We saw a young woman in Ipswich who'd got incredible IT skills, set up Ipswich Community Support. She set up sort of computer software that meant that she could recruit volunteers and match people up through sort of using her software and people's smartphones. Ipswich is a large town, and you know, she managed to cover the whole town. It was incredible what she could do. She then decided to put some sort of more kind of safeguarding, some processes behind it, because she was, as I say, covering such a large area and she didn't know the volunteers. It did lack that bit of sort of community knowledge. So that's why she felt that she needed to do a little bit more around the safeguarding. Felixstowe Scrubbers. They were a group in Felixstowe that had skills for dressmaking, so they were able to volunteer from home and made sort of hundreds and hundreds of sets of clothing. They also raised money for the materials, and again, you know, it was just literally over days that they were able to do this. And then we saw some more very sort of local, really sort of lovely things, like in Tunstall, a very small village in East Suffolk. a local person offered to do the fish and chip run on a Friday. So we've got everyone's order, went off to the fish and chip shop in another village, brought the fish and chips back, distributed them. So while everybody was eating their fish and chips separately, they know that they were eating them at the same time, and that's now a weekly occurrence. In Elmswell, they've got Sid the Snake, so they did the painting of the pebbles, created a snake, and now the community have got together to actually set them in concrete. So now that's a legacy of COVID that will always be there in the village. So just sort of talk a little bit now about what we saw around formal volunteering in Suffolk. So as diverse as volunteering is, so has the impact been on informal volunteering. We've seen charities having to completely pause their activity, sort of essentially furloughing some of their volunteers, others having to adapt the activities they were doing and how volunteers can help out. Others were losing volunteers due to self-isolating or shielding. Big challenges for these organisations. They had policies and procedures to follow, meaning that they kind of needed a bit more time to adapt. Also, funding restrictions meant that some of them just couldn't change direction, or they had to have, conversations with their funders to see what they could do. But some volunteer coordinators were furloughed. So how do they keep in touch with volunteers? They've got the questions of how do volunteers return to role? Will they be coming back? Will the thousands of people that wanted to volunteer and felt ignored, will they now have a negative view of volunteering? St Elizabeth Hospice in Ipswich, they wanted to deliver an enhanced palliative and end-of-life care provision for COVID-19. So they set up a logistics hub to coordinate volunteers to secure and deliver equipment of PPE and medication to their community. Volunteers team was set in motion. They set up a much faster recruitment process using virtual recruitment of volunteers, initiating electronic systems to onboard volunteers and redeploy current volunteers. They managed to recruit new volunteers with new skills ready to support the hub. They built new relationships with volunteers and brought staff across from the hospice to work together that didn't normally. And for those volunteers who couldn't attend the hospice, many continued to support from home, making scrubs and masks or sending food and gifts to the teams. They offered free training to keep volunteers busy who were staying at home. And the feedback is from their volunteers that they felt valued, they felt included, they look forward to returning to role, those that have had to pause, and those that are new to role want to continue and have enjoyed the new experience and the skills. The voluntary network, a befriending network in West Suffolk, they had to quickly move their face-to-face befriending to telephone. So they were able to do that, engage with new volunteers, and it meant that also their existing volunteers who were possibly shielding were still able to volunteer. They still had a purpose, they still had a role, they were still making a difference. And some of the clients that they've been offering befriending to have actually quite enjoyed the telephone calls, and they've said that they would like that to continue. Home Start in Suffolk, they had to again move their services to being on the telephone, and also they were recruiting new volunteers, and they have quite a comprehensive training package, but they were able to quickly move that online for those volunteers that were able to do that, while sort of pausing some volunteers that maybe need to still have the face-to-face volunteering later on. So as I say, as a sort of team at CAS, we've had to now think, what now? What has informal volunteering taught us? Is it time to reflect and change? So in response to that, we're running a campaign called Volunteering the 2020 Vision to sort of try and understand the changing face of volunteering. So we're asking ourselves and others, what is the public reaction to COVID-19 telling us about volunteering? What do we learn from the innovative nature of informal volunteering to benefit formal volunteering and vice versa? And are they different things, or are they in the continuum of the same act of sharing your time for free to benefit others? How do we encourage the social action to continue? We're going to be asking, have we overcomplicated volunteer management in formal volunteering? And have we been inadvertently blocking informal volunteering? Halesworth Volunteer Centre, the manager there, Emma Healy, she said she needed the informal volunteering. She needed those mutual aid groups, the neighbourliness in her community to allow her volunteer befriending scheme to be able to operate and sort of support those people in the community that weren't being able to access a neighbour. she couldn't have done what she did without the neighbourliness. Does informal volunteering feel more reciprocal, and is it more effective at building connected communities? Do we need to change our language? Volunteers, social action, doing good, giving time. What do we call our volunteer leaders? How do we reach out to people that are supporting, working alongside volunteers who don't really see that as their role? They're just sort of making a difference. How do we reach out to them? So as Tracy said before, and hopefully some of you would have read it, her blog, I think it was sent out before this session, do take a read of it. And then if you go to the Community Action Suffolk website where the blog is, there's also a blog from one of our volunteering officers, Faye Smith, around innovative volunteering. And then Mike Locke, who's the co-author of the Volunteer Complete Management Handbook, I don't know if it's on there yet, but there'll be a blog from Mike Locke around informal and formal volunteering, which is a really interesting read. So thank you.
Thank you, Sally, and that was really fascinating to hear about all the innovative things that have come up, as well as all those sort of steadfast things that were able to be flexible and find new ways of working. One of which I think is Anne. So I'm nicely segueing into Anne, giving us a little bit of an overview of how the Rural Coffee Caravan and Meet Up Mondays have supported people through this time.
Okay, so I think probably it would be quite useful to start off by giving you an example of what the Coffee Caravan would do in normal times. So there is a village in Suffolk called Brampton that has had a very rundown village hall that nobody wanted to use because it had kind of been appropriated by someone who was using the adjacent playing field as a camping caravanning park, ostensibly to get money to repair the village hall, but probably best not to go into that too much. But anyway, it meant that they couldn't use their village hall. So they asked the Coffee Caravan if they would come along and conduct a visit, because they felt that there was real division now in the village. They had no community spirit, or at least they had no route for that community spirit to show itself. So could we come along and just see if they could get everybody together? So we went along and we did go into their village hall, which was an absolute health and safety nightmare. It was full of stuff that shouldn't be there. It was full of wires flowing all over the place. It had a one-armed bandit in the corner that was obviously supposed to be for this caravan and camping park. It was awful. And it was cold and it was dirty. But actually, about 7 or 8 people came along to that first one, which wasn't expected at all. They didn't think they'd get anybody. There's 2 or 3 people who'd asked us to come, didn't actually think they were going to get anyone, but they did. And we set out our tablecloths. We make it look very nice and cozy and pretty. If you saw us from a distance on a village green, you think it was probably a private picnic. It's very friendly and informal. And we had lots of homemade cake, and we made coffee, and we sat down and talked to everybody that was there, and we spoke to them individually, and we spoke to them as a group. And they asked us if we would come again. So we started to go on a regular basis, and the numbers started to increase, and we started to learn more about the problems that they were having. And that enabled us to refer them to help. Lots of pro bono help for financial matters. We referred them to Community Action Suffolk for village hall expertise. We sent them off to the village hall conference that happened to be coming up. We found out individual problems that needed referring for this, that, and the other bit of help. The vicar started to come along, and he had time to talk to people that he perhaps didn't normally speak to because they didn't go to church. And anyway, to cut a long story short, after a year, they now have a village hall committee. They have extricated themselves from this rather strange arrangement that was going on. They've refurbed their village hall. It's all been recarpeted, repainted. The kitchen's all been spruced up. The bathroom has been made usable. And they're holding events there now. And they very reluctantly let us go, but we had to say, you really don't need us anymore. We've done everything that we can do for you. And it was meant to be for you to be able to do it for yourselves, which is what has happened. And so off they go on their own. So that's an example of some of the work that we would do. Other visits are completely outside because they have no amenities at all. We went to a village we were asked to go so that their social amenities committee could meet because they have no social amenities. So they met in the middle of a field to decide what they could do to make things happen. So we try to act as a catalyst for change and to work alongside a village rather than doing anything to it or for it. We try to get them able to do it for themselves and for each other. And in our experience over the last 16 years, community spirit has always been there. It's just that they haven't really known how to show it, what permission they have to show how much neighborliness that they might like to, plus busy lives, ships that pass in the night, with work, different work patterns, has makes connection quite hard. You have to put an effort in. Anyway, lockdown showed that when the chips are down, we are there for each other. And we believe that we now have a great opportunity for lasting change in our communities. You know, we've stayed home to keep each other safe. We've social distanced to keep each other safe. We wear masks to keep each other safe. And I've seen that described as an act of love. And there's a fantastic poem by Benjamin Zephaniah that says people will always need people. And one of the reasons is to give life meaning and to make life appealing. And in our experience, that is absolutely true. And so when lockdown happened, our face-to-face stuff died overnight. Like a lot of organisations who only deal face-to-face, we could do nothing. So very cognizant of the fact that not everybody is online, we went two ways. We knew that Community Action Suffolk were right on it in terms of getting the volunteering, the formal volunteering, the hubs and all the rest of it going. And I know Sally was working with her, with Jane, her colleague Jane, to get these Good Neighbour schemes up and running really, really fast. So for Suffolk County Council, we're giving out information. There was nothing for us to do in that regard. So we decided that we would create a really positive, fantastic web page for things that you could do to creatively connect while physically distanced. We filled our calendar with things that people could link into, things that could be streamed, anything from the Royal Ballet to all sorts of stuff, local stuff, national stuff. And we got all our communities, we sent all our communities a phone tree model. Now, if you're my age, you will know what a phone tree is, but possibly if you're Sally's age, you might not. Phone trees, everybody know what a phone tree is? Okay, so a phone tree is where one person phones two people, those two people phone another two people, and so on. And back in the day, we used it to say that Rainbows wasn't on or Brownies wasn't going that night. But we asked them if they would make these into talking trees. So don't just ring people to see how they are, ring people and have a chat about how they are and what they've been doing. And one lovely story from that was that two households had moved in the week before lockdown, knew nobody, but got included in the phone tree and now have relationships where they hadn't met anyone, but they had these friendships that, I mean, lockdown is easing and now they can get together. But the phone trees were really effective for people who couldn't access online. We had another village that immediately set up a community support fund to very discreetly give money to people who might be struggling to buy food. That was done with the local church and a lot of trust, but it worked absolutely beautifully. Another village, there, a woman who is a night nurse had never met anyone on her street, but she put a note through everyone's door one morning on her way home from work asking if they'd like to be part of a WhatsApp group, and they all said yes. So for 2 or 3 months, they were just chatting on WhatsApp without being able to meet each other. We encouraged an initiative called Backyard Buddies, where we got people to pull out a fence panel and have coffee in the back garden, each in their own back garden, but across the barrier. And we got some lovely photos of people doing that. Other villages were turning the clapping into an event. They were staying out and having drinks on the driveway together. We created some cup cards. If you go on our website, you can still see these cup cards. They're like little 3D cards that you can make, and you put a tea bag in, and then you pop it through someone's door to say, you know, you have your tea at 10 o'clock, I'll have my tea at 10 o'clock, and we'll be actually having a cup of tea together. We had loads of people making those cards, so that was really nice. And yeah, so we also had the vans going out delivering flowers. We got a flower grower to give us shed loads of cornflowers for next to nothing. So we put them all into bouquets, and we just went out to all our communities and left them on people's doorsteps. And people came out to talk to us, and they said that their villages were great. Like Sally said, Suffolk villages were phenomenal, but they were missing connection with more than one person. So they were really keen for us to come back out again. And we are going to start going back out on the 3rd of August in a slightly different way, but we think that we can manage it. But I think that the power that we have now is that so many more people are aware of what it feels like to be lonely. There will be many, many people who have experienced really desperate loneliness for the first time. My own daughter spent 11 weeks alone in a 2nd floor flat. You know, and I think that's powerful. I think the fact that we have that extra layer of knowledge of people who didn't know about it before is going to help us with our campaign to create more connected communities. There'll be more empathy, more sympathy, I think, out there. And that's what I feel we have to do now. We have to capture and preserve and keep hold of this neighbourliness, which I like to think of as just being good humans. And I think if one way forward for us will be to celebrate that. We'll be asking our communities for ways of celebrating their new neighbourliness. You can't unmake these relationships. You can't unknow these people that you've got to know better. So I think it's really important that we join things like the Connection Coalition and make a really loud voice about how important it is to invest in spaces and places where people in communities can make those connections, to make it a lot easier for people to come together in their communities. I mean, I know my own experience is really only rural, but spaces and places to connect are important right across the board. And there may be some really innovative opportunities. We will sadly see the demise of some high street shops, for example. Can those premises be used in more community-minded ways? I don't know, but I do think it's something to think about. But at the same time, we can and we must always do all the little things, the saying hello, the waving, just the smiling at people, asking how they are, offering to cut a lawn, receiving a jar of jam with thanks, all those things that just make us good humans. I think we've been doing it brilliantly for the last 3 months. There's no reason to stop doing any of that. And this familiarity will allow us to notice when things are amiss. We'll start to recognize that the more formal volunteering is required. I think it's a preventative thing as well. We know that loneliness can kill. So I think that if we can maintain this level, even just gentle levels of support, we are actually acting in a preventative way. And if you think you're being too nosy, so what? A shut door is better than actually somebody dying unnoticed. So I honestly think that it's just down to being good humans. I don't know whether to call it informal volunteering. I'm very afraid that some people won't accept help unless it's help from someone who's DBS'd, and I'm equally afraid that someone won't accept formal volunteering because they think they can't reciprocate, so they don't need the help. So like you say in your blog, you know, it's a very, very delicate line, but I think the fundamental is just being a good human.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now.
Thank you, Anne. No, that's perfect. And I think it is so true. And you mentioned a word there that I think will resonate with us all. And thank you, Sally. What the crisis has done is give us permission to connect. It's give us a purpose, and it's give us a reason. For some of us, it's give us time. And we often talk about that in the loneliness arena, about the permission of snow. When it snows, people's humanity comes to the fore. When there's a crisis, floods, disaster, a global pandemic, our humanity comes to the fore. I'm not as optimistic as Anne. I think once the crisis wavers, so will our humanity again, and other things will get in the way of us and our need to connect with each others. I'm hoping a lot of people will have shifted on that line and re-evaluated their lives or reconnected with people and seen the importance of people now. And I think there will be a wealth of that. But I think as life moves on, we will also see that people's time to connect with each other will get squeezed again until there's maybe another crisis. So how do we hold on to that? And should we? So this is the question. I'm aware some people are going at 5, but we were till 15:15. But sorry, those who have to go, we don't get to hear from you. That's a shame. But we were going to just pose the question. We're going to pop you in groups, just have a think about it, and then come back into the bigger group. Because I just think it's really hard just to warm up as a big group. But if you said a couple of things to 1 or 2 other people, it's easier. But we were just wondering, listening to all that and knowing your experience, which could be agreeing with that or could be contrary to what we've said. What do you think as individuals we can do to give ourselves and others that permission, the time, the capacity, the agency to connect with others, be it formally or informally? For me, they both have value. But what is it that we think we can do to continue that, so that Anne says, so that we don't lose that connection once the crisis abates, if it ever does? Is that okay? Is that clear as mud? Lucy's going to bob the question in the chat. So just going to split you into groups. So just have 5 minutes, a little warm up, and then come back with the big points that you think, and we'll just wrap up with a sort of 10 minutes of an open discussion. Is that okay? You're doing well. Don't fall asleep yet. Let's keep going. We're nearly there. Some of us couldn't go into a group, so we just chatted in the main room. So that's what you heard there. We were talking about actually where, if it weren't for formal volunteering, some of us would not be where we are today. I wouldn't be, and we wouldn't have made the connections. And actually, our communities were left to charities and volunteering groups to sort of pick up when we went to work or left them. And that's why I think it's really important that we recognise and value both, and we don't say informal is better than formal and formal is better than, because they're just different. So I've heard enough of my voice, I'm sure you have. What are people's sort of thoughts, answers to the questions, more questions, reflections on today? What was the burning issue with your group that someone else might be able to help you with? Go on, Anne. Oh, and then Lindsay.
I think that we felt that there is a very strong case for positive messaging. Mm-hmm. That people, that everybody, whether they were formal volunteers, informal volunteers, just decent human beings, need to be appreciated for the effort that has been put in over the last few months, to be valued. People need to be valued, that we are on the other end all the time of a pretty negative campaign by media and in all its forms, and that there needs to be a much higher profile given to being good humans, and good humans may go on to be formal volunteers, and good humans may simply be good neighbours. So it's, you know, an uphill battle to get positive messaging, because it doesn't sell as much as bad messaging. But that doesn't mean that we should just roll over and not try.
No, I absolutely agree. I often say it's not a user-friendly society. It'd be quite nice if it was, and human beings were put at the heart of it and not our economy. Right, I've got 2 hands raised, and I think Lindsay wanted to come in first. I'm trying to check both screens because you're across 2. So Lindsay, do you want to go next, my love?
Yeah, it was a great wee chat with the ladies in my room, and my brain is whirring now. And I think we're all kind of preaching to the converted here. The one thing that I've found, and we were discussing briefly there, was about how the more informal volunteer structures are viewed by our statutory partners, and that really, I mean, the local authority here, I'm sorry, I've got children in the background, their hand was very much forced to be signposting people this time. But that is not how it would usually go at all. We all know that having a charity number does not mean that everything is amazing within that organisation, or that safeguarding is great, but that's how they view it. Like, it's on paper, so it's fine. A group of neighbours, no, we can't possibly. that's changed in the last few months, but I fully expect it to return to how it was before.
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with you, Lindsay. I think that's a very good point. Mary, I think you had your hand up. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, I think that's me. Hi. We were talking in our group just about time commitments, and I think you spoke about it as well, like when people are furloughed, they had time. And I work as a community connector, so as I see this quite often, is people fear kind of committing to volunteering because they're afraid that they're going to get locked into too much work. So I think we need to start doing pieces of work around mini bites, kind of like mini bits of volunteering that could be, I don't know, half an hour a month or whatever, and breaking things down into smaller chunks so people don't feel that if they volunteer once that then they're trapped in this kind of cycle of having to do something and then afraid that they might let people down in the future, and then that stops them from starting in the first place.
Oh, I muted myself, sorry. That's a really good point. Thank you. I think it's that being able to do it when you can fit it in and not that 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon is probably quite key for a lot of people. So that often needs a brokerage or something like that, so it becomes more complicated. So yeah, but a really, really important point about that informal stuff. Yes, sir, you've got your hand up. Would you like to mute yourself and contribute? And then I'm mindful of time, we're going to overrun.
No, I didn't have my mic without from before. I didn't have my hand up now.
Okay, I've lowered your hand then. Sorry, that was from before. I'm really mindful of the time, and it's 5:15 and people might have hungry children about to eat the door. Is there anything else anybody wants as a final reflection? I think we will have a evaluation popped into the chat. If you'd like to do a quick survey monkey for us, it doesn't take long, it just helps us learn. You can say Tracy was a Wally or whatever you like, or if you'd like to have a deeper discussion about this, if there's a particular issue you'd like to connect with, so it'd be really lovely to hear from you. But if anybody else feels that they'd like to say something, has a burning thought, moment of inspiration before we leave, I don't want to have anybody hanging. Oh, Jana. Oh, inspire us, Jana. Sorry, that's a bit
no, just to say that we have a similar event happening next week where we want to deepen some of those discussions, which will be around how to keep community spirit going after lockdown. So if you've been interested in this whole kind of what's changed recently since people were going back to work, etc., and how do we keep things going, then please join us next Wednesday lunchtime, and the event is on Facebook, on our Facebook page as always.
All right, well, if you like, we can put that in the follow-up email as well in case anybody's interested in that. Any further thoughts or anything before we say farewell? Oh, Jana is from Eden Project Communities, like myself and like Lucy. That would have been good to say at the beginning, wouldn't it? On that note, no. As always, can I thank you for being awesome human beings and for your generosity and your time and your brain cells this late on a Thursday. And Sally and Anne, I thank you so much for not only your continued decades of dedication, but for sharing that experience with us today. And Janet for being your technical whiz as well. So thank you, everybody, and we'll say farewell.